15 cents. That's the total amount of attractant I spent on my last Crappie trip. 15 cents out of a grocery store jar that's been sitting on American shelves for 100 years. And the tackle industry would rather you never figure out what's inside it. Here's what happened last Saturday. I'm anchored over a submerged brush pile in 14 feet of stained water. No LiveScope, no side imaging, no premium tackle box. Just a plain foam jig I dipped into a mason jar of red liquid for exactly 90 seconds. 3 minutes in, thump. A 9-inch white crappie comes up with the jig buried deep. 4 minutes later, another one. 47 minutes after that, I've stacked 11 crappie out of the same brush pile without moving the boat an inch. Here's the part that'll make your jaw drop. 30 yards off my stern, there's a guy running a full Garmin LiveScope rig. 3 screens glowing like a casino. Tackle box stuffed with neon nibbles, scented gels, imported dips. About $7,000 floating between his feet. He caught 2. When I finally pulled anchor, he idled over and asked what illegal import scent I was running. I held up the jar. Pickled beets. $1.29 at the corner store. He thought I was messing with him. I wasn't. That red liquid isn't food coloring. It's a concentrated natural solution of a compound called betaine. And the commercial fish farming industry has been guarding it like a state secret for 40 years. Today, we tear it open. The biology, the chemistry they won't print on the bottle, and the 3-method system that turned a $1.29 jar into 89 crappie in 2 weeks. Stick with me. This one changes how you fish forever. Section 1. The commercial aquaculture conspiracy. To understand why a grocery store jar outfishes an $8 premium gel, stop looking at your local tackle shop and start looking somewhere the average angler has never set foot. A commercial fish farm, concrete raceways, blue tanks the size of swimming pools, millions of juvenile fish being grown to market weight on the cheapest feed science can engineer. Here's the problem that kept aquaculture chemists awake for 3 decades. Fish meal, the natural diet, is expensive. Soybean meal is cheap. Farm profit depends on switching from the expensive stuff to the cheap stuff. But carnivorous fish have a built-in rejection response to plant protein. They won't eat it. A fish that won't eat doesn't grow. A fish that doesn't grow doesn't cash a check. So the industry went hunting for a molecular override. A chemical switch that could force a fish to eat something its instincts told it to reject. They found it in a sugar beet, the same root vegetable your grandmother canned for pot roast. Back in the 1860s, a chemist working with Beta vulgaris isolated a simple amino acid derivative and gave it a name, betaine, straight from the Latin for beet. Aquaculture researchers figured out that if they added even a trace of pure betaine to cheap plant feed, the fish ate it like it was live shad. Not reluctantly, ravenously. Juvenile carp trials showed daily weight gain jumping as high as 49%. Tilapia, catfish, across the board. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The fish didn't just eat the food. They kept eating it after their stomachs were physically full. Betaine flips a switch the industry calls a satiety override. Same principle the snack food engineers use when they design a potato chip you can't stop eating. Now, betaine is in every bag of commercial fish pellets produced in North America. Standard ingredient, mandatory. The industry that raises the fish on your grocery store ice will not, and this is the key part, will not sell pure concentrated betaine to the recreational angler. Why not? Same reason a pharmaceutical company won't tell you which generic works exactly like the brand name. You can't charge $35 for a bottle of Pro-Staff Crappie Elixir if the guy at the counter knows the active ingredient costs $1.29 in the canned vegetable aisle. So the question becomes, if they've been using this compound to control fish behavior inside concrete raceways for decades, what is it actually doing to a wild crappie's brain when you drip it off a foam jig? That answer is where the science turns genuinely strange. Section 2. The biological hijack. Imagine you're a crappie, 6 inches of silvery muscle hovering in 14 feet of murky water, watching for anything that moves like food. Now imagine a minnow 40 feet away gets clipped by a largemouth and breaks in half. Its cells rupture. Protein, amino acids, and a molecule called betaine bleed out into the water like smoke from a smoldering log. Within seconds, that chemical smoke drifts through the brush pile you're hiding in. You don't see it. You don't smell it the way we smell things. But your body already knows a meal just got hit, because 60 million years of evolution has wired your nervous system to detect that exact signature and route it past your thinking brain straight to the strike response. That's what betaine is. Not a flavor, not a scent in the human sense. A distress signal encoded in the bleeding flesh of dying prey. And crappie are built to hunt it. Now to the chemistry, plain as I can put it. Betaine is what chemists call a zwitterion, a molecule carrying both a positive and a negative charge on the same frame, balanced out to neutral. What that means for you and me is that it dissolves in water instantly and completely. The moment that jig hits the lake, you've already started broadcasting. Crappie, scientific name Pomoxis, are covered in what biologists call chemoreceptors. Think of them as microscopic tongues. They line the lips, the barbels, the inside of the mouth, and parts of the body you wouldn't expect. A crappie doesn't taste the water the way you taste coffee. It reads the water the way you read a book. Full chapters of chemical information every second. When a betaine molecule lands on one of those chemoreceptor cells, it locks into something called a G-protein coupled receptor. Picture a key sliding into a lock that's been waiting for it since the Cretaceous. The second that lock turns, an electrical signal fires down the cranial nerve into the fish's brain, and the strike response activates before the fish has a chance to think about it. This is the part the science papers don't advertise. Betaine doesn't make a crappie hungrier. It bypasses hunger entirely. It hijacks the predatory circuit. There's a second effect, and it's why crappie hold on to a betaine-soaked jig longer than a plain one. Betaine enhances what biologists call gustatory perception, the fish's ability to taste amino acids in whatever it just grabbed. So when that crappie inhales your foam jig, its brain gets a blast of information screaming, "This is high-protein food, do not spit it out." Extra half-second on the hook set. In crappie fishing, that's the difference between a full box and a long drive home. The industry knew all of this by the mid-1980s, published in peer-reviewed journals, verified in hatcheries. So why did tackle manufacturers never build a real product around pure betaine? You're about to find out. And it involves a test I ran last month that frankly embarrassed 3 of the biggest names on the shelf. Section 3, exposing the tackle shop scent scam. Walk into any big box outdoor store. The scent aisle is a wall of promises. Garlic sprays, shad oils, pro staff gels, tournament-grade dips. Every bottle dressed up with a photo of a trophy fish and a price tag between $6 and $9. I bought 3 last month, a popular garlic spray, a premium shad oil, a pro staff endorsed crappie gel that runs about $9 for a 2-ounce tube. Then I set up the kind of test the industry pays people not to run. Same lake, same brush pile, same jig style, same hook, same line. 4 identical foam crappie jigs. I rotated through the 3 commercial scents and my 15-cent beet juice 1 jig per hour, switching boat position by 5 feet each rotation so I wasn't fishing down the same fish. 1 hour each. Results: garlic spray, 2 crappie. Shad oil, 1 crappie. Premium pro staff gel, 0. 1 entire hour, over-documented active fish, didn't pull a single bite. Beet juice, 7 crappie. Here's the part the industry really doesn't want you reading. Pull up the material safety data sheets on commercial fishing scents. These are public documents searchable online, and you'll find something the bottles don't advertise. Most of what's in there is propylene glycol, mineral oil, thickening agents, preservatives, and synthetic flavor compounds. The active amino acid content? Independent lab assays put it between 1 and 2%. The other 98% is shelf-stable filler, engineered to keep the bottle from spoiling in a warehouse for 3 years. You're paying $8 for thick oil that gums up your line. Now look at what's in a jar of pickled beets. Beet juice, vinegar, salt, sugar, occasionally cloves. That's it. And depending on how long those beets have sat in brine, the betaine concentration in the liquid runs anywhere from 8 to 12%. Direct extraction from plant tissue, leached slowly over weeks of refrigerated storage. 8 to 12% versus 1 to 2%. 4 to 6 times more active compound in a product that costs a sixth of the price. Let me run the math so there's nothing left to argue. 16-ounce jar of pickled beets, $1.29. Drain the beets, you get about 6 ounces of liquid. I treated 40 jigs off that 1 jar across 2 weeks of fishing. 3 2/10 cents per application. $8 commercial bottle. Average user gets about 30 applications before it's gone. 27 cents per use. The beet juice isn't a little cheaper. It's 8.5 times cheaper while being demonstrably stronger. That is not a gimmick. That is the industry counting on you not to read labels. But if you think cost and concentration are the real story, you're missing the deepest reason betaine works. Because on a brutal post-frontal morning when everybody else is getting skunked, this molecule does something to a fish's body that has nothing to do with feeding. And that is the real forbidden piece. Section 4, the osmoregulation hack. Every angler knows the day. Cold front pushed through overnight, barometer spiked, sky went bluebird. You pull up on the brush pile that produced a limit yesterday and today it's a graveyard. Fish are there, your electronics show them, but nothing's biting. Here's what the tackle industry won't tell you is happening inside those fish. Imagine every cell in a crappie's body as a tiny water balloon. That balloon is under constant pressure from the water outside and the fluid inside, and the fish burns energy around the clock, keeping the pressure balanced. When conditions are stable, it's a background task. But when something swings hard, a 10-degree water temperature drop, a sudden rain runoff, a late summer ammonia spike in a backwater slough, those cellular balloons start to warp. Proteins unfold, enzymes slow, the fish's whole metabolism drags, and the last thing it wants to do is chase a lure. Now, betaine is what biochemists call a compatible solute. In plain English, it's molecular packing foam. When a fish is stressed and its cells are struggling to hold shape, betaine slides into the cytoplasm and physically stabilizes the structure from the inside. Proteins stay folded. Enzymes keep working. The fish goes from surviving to functioning. Published research on Nile tilapia showed betaine supplementation dropped cellular damage markers, specifically a compound called malondialdehyde, which is basically cellular rust, by significant margins during thermal stress. Similar protective effects have been documented in trout and carp across multiple university aquaculture programs. Read that carefully. When the water gets rough, fish don't just prefer betaine, they biologically crave it. Their bodies are wired to seek it out the way a dehydrated hiker is wired to seek water. I tested this at a private pond last winter. Surface temp 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Crappie were holding tight to a fallen oak in 8 feet of water, visible on the electronics, stacked like cordwood. Lethargic. Post-frontal. Brutal. Dropped an unscented foam jig 2 feet in front of the lead fish. Watched it for 22 minutes. Nothing. Not a flicker. Pulled it up, dipped an identical jig in beet juice for 90 seconds. Dropped it in the same spot. 6 minutes. A 10-inch black crappie eased off the log, cruised over, and inhaled it. Same lure, same depth, same fish. The only variable was a chemical they were wired to chase even when their hunger had shut down. Now consider muddy water. After a heavy rain, when the creek runs the color of chocolate milk and visibility drops below 12 inches, crappie can't use their eyes. They're running on chemoreception entirely. I fished a stained creek arm last April, couldn't see my jig 6 inches below the surface, and pulled 9 crappie out of that mud hole in 40 minutes, all on beet-soaked foam. So you might be thinking, all right, if betaine is that powerful, why not just buy pure betaine HCl off a supplement website and build my own super scent? A reader emailed me about exactly that last month, and here's why that email scared me. Section 5, the bell curve trap. There's a graph tucked into the back of a peer-reviewed paper on fish behavior that the tackle industry really doesn't want anglers to find. It's called a dose-response curve, and if you plot betaine concentration against strike rate, it doesn't climb in a straight line. It rises, peaks, and drops off a cliff. In controlled laboratory tests on multiple freshwater species, scientists found that the maximum aggressive feeding response kicks in at a betaine concentration of roughly 15.66 parts per million. For reference, that's about 0.2%. Call it 1 teaspoon dissolved in a standard bathtub of water. At that concentration, fish don't just bite, they attack. But here's the part that'll make you rethink every more is better instinct you've got as an angler. When researchers pushed the concentration up to 25 parts per thousand, 100 times past the sweet spot, the fish didn't just stop biting, they fled. At high concentrations, betaine flips from a feeding trigger to a warning flag. The fish's brain interprets the massive chemical density the same way you'd interpret walking into a room that smells overwhelmingly of blood. Something is very wrong here, and I am leaving. This is the trap that ruins do-it-yourself scent cookers. A guy orders a pound of 97% pure betaine HCl off a supplement website for $35. Figures more is better, soaks a bag of soft plastics in heavy solution, and proceeds to salt the best brush pile on his home lake. Every crappie in a 40-foot radius books it for the next county. He can't figure out why his spot died. The 15-cent pickled beet juice sidesteps this entire problem by accident of the pickling process itself. The betaine in pickled beet brine is pre-diluted by the cooking water, the vinegar, the salt, and whatever spices the packer threw in. That dilution keeps the total active concentration in a range that, when a soaked jig drops into a lake, diffuses out right around that 0.2% strike response sweet spot. The vinegar does something else interesting. The acid in the brine mimics the structure of betaine hydrochloride, the form that binds most aggressively to fish chemoreceptors. So you're hitting the perfect concentration, in a form that's chemically optimized for the target receptor. Nature, in other words, already figured out the math that home brewers keep blowing up on. The industry knows this. The hatchery formulators know this. Nobody at your local tackle shop has told you to, and that's exactly why this channel exists. Which brings us to the part you actually came for. How do you weaponize this stuff on the water, and what are the three methods that have been quietly outperforming premium tackle for decades?
We arrange the foam jig in the jar precisely like this before we begin the retrieve.
Section 6. The Masterclass. One piece of cleanup first. The red color is meaningless. I filtered a jar of beet juice through a coffee filter until it came out almost clear. Same jig, same catch rate. This isn't about visual attraction. It's about chemistry. 3 methods, ranked by application. Method 1, the 90-second dip. Material matters. Hard plastic crankbaits are useless here. Surface is sealed. Liquid washes off in 2 casts. Waste of time. Soft plastics work okay, better than bare plastic, not great. Foam jigs are kings. Absorbent, porous. They hold liquid the way a sponge holds water. Dip a foam crappie jig into your beet juice jar for 90 seconds. Pull it out. Let it drip. In still water, 1 dip broadcast betaine for about 25 minutes before you need to refresh. In moving water or river current, closer to 12 to 15 minutes. Simple, cheap, deadly. Method 2. The bait pump injection. This is for vertical jigging or slow trolling, what the pros call tight lining. You want a slow, continuous chemical leak from the lure itself rather than a one-shot dip. Grab a small bait pump, load it with a paste, crushed commercial crappie nibbles mixed with a few drops of beet juice until it's the consistency of wet sand. Inject that paste straight into the hollow cavity of a tube jig. Pinch the tube closed around the hook. Now you've got a lure leaking betaine every second it's in the water. Creates a localized feeding zone. Fish come from 3 times the distance they would for a plain dip. Method 3. The 12-hour pre-soak. This is the tournament move. Take a dozen soft plastic jigs, drop them into a Ziploc bag, pour in enough pickled beet juice to fully submerge, seal it. Stick it in the back of your fridge overnight. Minimum 12 hours, ideally 24. What happens at the molecular level is worth knowing. The plastic matrix of soft baits isn't solid. It's porous at the microscopic scale. Given enough time in a high-concentration brine, betaine and vinegar molecules diffuse into the plastic itself. You're not coating the lure anymore, you're loading it. A pre-soaked jig keeps broadcasting betaine for 18 hours of active fishing before you notice any drop-off. I used this exact method in a local open tournament last fall where rules restricted attractants to non-toxic, biodegradable products. Pickled beet juice cleared the rulebook. It's a USDA-regulated food product. My pre-soaked jigs were legal, active, and effective from first cast to weigh-in. Caught my 5-fish limit inside the first 2 hours. Spent the rest of the morning watching guys with $1,000 electronics stare at screens. One last thing. Betaine is chemically stable, doesn't evaporate in heat, doesn't break down in sunlight, doesn't rot in a warm tackle box. I've got a mason jar of beet brine that's been living in my truck through a hot summer for 30 days, and it pulled fish on day 30 as hard as day 1. The industry sells you scents with a 6-month shelf life printed on the bottle for a reason. Betaine doesn't need that sticker. Conclusion. Final scorecard on one $1.29 jar of pickled beets. 15 cents per outing, 89 crappie, 14 bluegill, 7 channel catfish I didn't even expect. Turns out cats go sideways for betaine too, which is a whole other video. The math is done. The science is published. The only thing left is whether you act on it or keep handing over $8 at a time for diluted oil in a fancy bottle. Next time you roll up to the lake, skip the scent aisle, walk 3 aisles over, grab pickled beets, soak your foam, and get ready for a very quiet boat ride home while the guy next to you on the LiveScope wonders what just happened. If you want the next one in this series, a banned European carp tactic that American tournament circuits are actively trying to classify as a regulated additive before it spreads, it's already in the pipeline. Subscribe or don't. The fish don't care either way. But your neighbor with the $3,200 electronics setup? He should probably hope you keep scrolling past. Drop a comment below. Tell me the weirdest grocery store bait you've ever outfished the pros with. I read every one of them, and the best ones end up in future videos. Until next time, keep your lines tight and your secrets quiet.